So I guess I can just introduce myself. I think you guys know my name, but I've been in the animation for about 25, 30 years. 22 years of that was spent at Pixar. I got hired for A Bug's Life, and I basically stayed there until 2018, working on all manner of films, working with different directors. And even though it was the same company, every movie was a different experience. Every director's different, just like any of you are going to do things. You're going to work with different people that like things and don't like things. And so everything I'm going to talk about is everything I learned on that job. Before I went to Pixar, I actually worked on The Nightmare Before Christmas. Has anybody seen that at all? Yes, that was my very first job. And then I worked on James and the Giant Peach, which was also really fun. In between those movies, I did freelance at a company called Colossal Pictures. I don't know if anybody knows that. They're not around anymore. But I always talk about that because it's okay if you don't get into the big studios. It's great to work for smaller places, and you're going to get great experiences and meet different people. And everything I did helped me get my job at Pixar. So I often say it's better to try to work for some smaller places if you can, and sort of work your way up to doing something. Because the larger the company you work for, the smaller the role you're going to play. If you work for a smaller company, you're going to play a bigger role. You get to meet different people, do different things. That's a whole nother talk I could do, but I just wanted to give you some background. But let me start sharing my screen here, and let's get into this presentation. Okay, so I want to do this. All right, can everyone see this? Yes, can they see? Yes, you can see this? Okay, so I'm gonna show one clip, so make sure your audio is on, and let's get going. So this is called visual storytelling, and I'm gonna basically talk mostly about staging and composition. So again, I was at Pixar. I was a story artist. I was also the head of story on 2 projects, on Cars 2 and the Blue Umbrella, which I think was in front of Monsters University. Those were both great experiences, and that's a whole nother world of work that you can get into. These are some of the movies I worked on: A Bug's Life, Toy Story 2, Monsters Incorporated, Finding Nemo, Ratatouille I worked on for like a year. That was before Brad Bird got on. Wall-E I worked on. Cars 2, obviously. Brave. So these are some of the movies I got to work on. Then I got to do The Blue Umbrella, which was the only short I got to work on, but I loved the experience. And I recommend anybody that gets a chance to do a short, do it, because the production schedule is smaller and you get to try different things. I got to work on Finding Dory, which was really fun. I hadn't drawn those characters in like 10 years, so that was really fun to do something new but old. The Good Dinosaur. Coco I spent about 2.5 years on, and maybe a minute of my work ended up in the movie. So just to point it out, sometimes when you're doing story on a feature for that long, not everything you do is going to make it on there. I did finally get to work with Brad Bird on Incredibles 2, which was really fun. It was only like 3 months, but I can understand why people love working with him. He was great. And these are the last 2 films I worked on before I left. Has anyone seen Onward? I'm sure some of you have. Yes, hopefully. I really enjoyed working with those guys. And then Soul was the last thing I worked on, and it's supposed to come out in June, but I think it's been pushed. So hopefully that will come out this year, and you will get to see it. So I'm going to go ahead and dive into storyboarding the process. So this is what storyboarding is like. It's a great illustrated process by the late Joe Rampt, who was my teacher at Cal Arts, where I went to college. And he also was the head of story on A Bug's Life, the first movie I worked on, and we became good friends. So I always like to show this because this illustrates what storyboarding is like, I think, at any sort of large studio with big groups of people. So there's the story man or story woman working away, and you have your calendar. You have to budget your time. I'm still terrible at that. I love to procrastinate. So he's working away, and you're pinning up your boards. We don't do so much of that anymore. But I like this because you're still putting up dialogue strips, and I love working this way. And then the story artist is thinking, how do I work? How do I make this better? And this is my favorite board because this basically says everything about what you're doing when you're storyboarding. You're worrying about the acting of your characters. You're worrying about the writing, the script pages that you're getting. Sometimes it's just beats and you have to fill in the gaps and do what you want to do. And then there's the cutting, there's the editing. That's one of the most important things that you learn is that, it's not just about one storyboard, it's about hundreds of storyboards, and they all have to string together and work well. And then about composition and staging. Those are the things I'm going to focus on today. How do you make an interesting image that is going to help the story? So the story person is hard at work, drawing, pinning, throwing things away, pinning, Ah, yes. Okay, now I'm ready to pitch my storyboard. And then this is terrifying. You go up and you used to have to pitch and act out your whole sequence in front of a big group of people and the director and lots of other folks. Now we sort of do everything on the Cintiq, but you still have to pitch the sequence and sell it. And then there's John. Ah, yes. He's thinking, and other people are around. And then, often when you're pitching these things, someone has an idea and they throw it out there, and then it's very creative, very collaborative. This is often what it's like. It can be a little much, but there's a lot of creative differences, and you're moving boards around, ideas are coming around. Why don't we try this and that? And you learn very quickly not to take it personally when they're tearing your work apart and giving you notes. It's all for the better. It's all for the better of the film. It'll make it better. And then you learn how to edit yourself. You learn how to take notes. And this is often what it's like after a session. You're exhausted and you see all the yellow Post-its there. That's how we used to put all our notes, Post-its on the boards. And then the story person wakes up. What just happened? It's exhausting. Now you can literally go back to the drawing board, but it's very important that you kept track of all of the notes that you got. And there are production assistants and people like that that will be taking notes, but it's very important that you take them yourself. I think it's very important to pay attention and be organized. And you learn that quickly because everything is changing. The boards are being redone. There's different versions you have to keep track of. And then you go back to work. And that's often what it's like. And so normally we do one rough pass, and then we'll do a second pass. And then you ideally get some notes. And then the third pass, the director looks at it, and then you send it to editorial. But you're working with a whole team of people. You're working with anywhere from 6 to 12 to maybe 10 people. And everyone's doing sequences all at the same time. So it can get very confusing, but it's also very creatively fun. This is the picture I took from Finding Dory, where we were actually working on paper, and I loved it. So I took a picture just because I wanted to show people this is often what it used to be. We would pin up all our boards, and then this is after a session. So you see all the Post-its, and there's some boards that are off. There's some new drawings that are pinned up. But I love working this way, and I would recommend if you guys can, you could do storyboards on index cards, you could tape them to the wall, you can move them around. It's nice to have everything up and displayed. It's hard to replace that. So I recommend it, at least for the beginning of whatever project that you're doing. Okay, now I took this picture because I couldn't remember which cup of coffee that I was drinking, and I sent it to my wife, like, I think I'm drinking too much coffee. But this is often what everything looks like now. You have your Cintiq, you have another screen. I still do lots of stuff on paper. You see all the movies and music I have stacked up there, but this is just an example of what one office setup is like. I have an office set up like this at home now, which is quite nice. So I'm gonna show you guys a sequence, an animatic for Finding Nemo. I had a lot of fun working on the sequence. This is the anglerfish sequence when Dory and Father go way down into the dark, and then they find the anglerfish. But then they also find the diving mask. Remember, that has the information they need. In this version, it was a license plate that they were finding and not a diving mask. But I wanted to show this to you because we spent a lot of time with the lighting, but also just making sure that everything worked. But this is a good example of what a scene looks like in one of our movies. Okay, so make sure your audio is up, and let's play this.
Look, over there. Do you see that? I see it. I'm freezing. Let's get closer. Maybe it's warm, huh? What is it?
I have no idea. I can't seem to stop looking at it.
It's so pretty.
I can't see where I'm going! Plate!
What plate?
The plate we're looking for!
We're looking for a plate?
Yeah!
Okay, I can't see a thing.
Just stay where you are. It's right around here somewhere. It's right here.
Whoa, something's touching me. Something's got me.
That's me. That's me. I'm sorry.
Hey, look, a license plate.
Quick, read it. I'll distract him.
Distract who?
Yeah!
Sorry, but could you bring him closer? I kind of need the light. That's great. Keep it right there.
What does it say? Yeah!
Well, if you could just maybe hold it steady.
Just read it!
Okay. Silly. Sydney! Sydney, the first word, Sydney! Thank you very much. Okay, number 2. Light, please. Second word's new. Sydney Snoot. Suit.
Hurry.
South. Sydney Snoot South. Read out. Last word is whale. Whale. It's whale. Sydney, the new South whale.
Sydney, the New South Whale. What does that mean?
I don't know.
The memories. Okay, so that's an example of one scene amongst many, and usually our movies have anywhere from 30 to 60, maybe even 70 sequences that are all storyboarded like that with sound and sound effects and music and all of that stuff. The reason I wanted to show you guys that sequence is because if you storyboard it and it works, as you can see with the storyboards compared to the final image in the movie, they're very similar. But I can guarantee you the drawings that I did were done basically 2 years probably before the release of the movie. That just goes to show you it goes through a long process of getting to final production. But that's what storyboards do, is that they lock it in, they know where the camera's gonna be, and it works. So this is one of the few sequences I've done that basically it ended up being almost exactly the same, except for the fact that the license plate turned into a mask. But you can see that the shots look exactly like what ended up on the screen. That's what I love about storyboarding, and that's hopefully what you guys will get at some point, is if you do the work right and it works, it will translate onto the screen. But not always. Sometimes a lot of stuff you do doesn't make it. But this is a great example of why storyboards work. This is another example, as often.
You
yes.
have a question. It says,
We have a question, yes.
is it true that P. Sherman name came from the way Filipinos say fisherman? Because there was a Filipino-American story artist in the team. Was Ronnie on the team?
Oh, Ronnie was on the team, but I don't remember that specifically. But he was the head of story at one point, like halfway through the movie. He was great. That was the movie that I met Ronnie and ended up working with him on. He was awesome. So this is basically a great illustration of having a map. If you're storyboarding a sequence and you're in a space that's kind of complex, or you don't know where to put the camera, it's really important to draw yourself a map. It can be very crude. It doesn't have to be very complex, but it will help you understand where to put the camera. These are all storyboards from Finding Dory, and they were basically the scene where they're in the tidal pool. Remember, all the hands are going in the water. And so all of these storyboards helped the camera people understand where the camera was going and where all these things were happening. So this is a good example of having a map. It's very important. And I learned that quickly when I was storyboarding certain sequences where I got confused and I was just sort of putting the camera wherever. They would say, just draw yourself a nice map and let's go over it together so we know where to put the camera. So again, this is a great example of how production uses storyboards to actually find out where the camera is going, which is very important, especially on a feature. Again, let's cut back to this. So these are the things that are so important when you're storyboarding, and you're always thinking about this. You're thinking about the acting, you're thinking about the writing, the editing, the composition, and the staging. So we're gonna look at some examples of just ways that you can get these things done. So one of the things that I highly recommend, and not everyone does this, you don't have to, but I love thumbnailing. I think thumbnails are incredibly important because you can work rough, you can test out your ideas, you're not wasting a lot of time doing heavily rendered images, because that's exactly what you shouldn't be doing when you're storyboarding, at least not at the beginning. And then shot flow is really important. This is probably what took me the longest to learn, is that all of your boards are going to be connected, as you just saw. And then Atomic, all your drawings are going to be flowing quickly, sometimes for just shorter than a second, but all of those shots have to work together. And so when you're thumbnailing, and that can help you do that. You're focused on your camera work, your staging, your composition, your editing. Someone had mentioned this to me when I worked at Pixar, saying you can draw your way to a solution. I know a lot of guys that would just basically write notes, and there's nothing wrong with that. I would like to just draw. I would do constant thumbnails, and as you can see with this little image on the right, I'm kind of doing that all the time, doodling, trying to think of interesting composition, interesting staging. And then last but not least, you have to show a pass on the sequence. And as I mentioned earlier, procrastination is something I constantly deal with. And so I found out, if I thumbnail, I can do a rough pass on the entire sequence, and then I can go to the Xerox machine, blow it up, and make it look a little bigger. And then I would pin them all up on a board. But it's very important to show up on a pass with the entire sequence roughed out. It's not good if you show up and it's not quite done, because you might have wasted time drawing larger storyboards and getting into the nitty-gritty and getting into details, which is really what you should be avoiding. So again, that's why I think thumbnails are great. It took me a long time to get into thumbnails and to learn how to do it, but I do it all the time now, and it does help me sort of get to the final product. Another really important thing is, even in the thumbnail stage, what is the aspect ratio of the project that you're working on? As you can see, these are just 4 examples. There's 137, 166, 185, 235. And as you can see, the aspect ratio of 137 is quite different from 235. And what you can draw in that framing is very different. So it's really good to know what that is. That's often the very first question I ask on a project. What is the aspect ratio? If you know it, the sooner you know, the better you can use that framing to make good images. So on Nemo, it was a tricky thing. We had a lot of scenes where they were swimming in the open ocean, and so we couldn't put anything in the background at times. We'd often have to draw a grid below or above. But I did a lot of studies like this. These are just studies that I would do on my own. I might even show these to the director, just say, what do you think about this? What do you think about using these things in the background, or these things in the scene as part of the story? So I did a lot of this, a lot of just, again, thumbnailing, trying to think of interesting compositions. Scenes like this where he's with his son. I think this is when they were going to school. How can we make it look like there's maybe a little bit of a ceiling with the coral? The shot on the bottom left, I just was, again, looking for interesting images, and that's what I'm always trying to do, hopefully, depending on what the project is. Again, just, can we use rocks? Can we use these other living things to make interesting images? So again, there's a lot of this. And if you do them small, you can blow them up, even on the computer, show them to the director. This is often what I would be showing. Thumbnails are also a great way for the director to talk to you. These are actually thumbnails that the director did for me on a sequence that I was working on. And it's great if your director can draw, because they can tell you stuff, but if they can sit down on a session and draw stuff for you, it's great. And as you can see, there are numbered. So this is another really important thing, is that you're doing so many shots that it's very important to stay organized, and you number your shots. So you can see here, there's shot 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and there's all these different ideas he has in there. These are very elaborate thumbnails, but I think it's because we were having a hard time figuring out this sequence. But very helpful if the director can draw and give these to you as sort of a game plan to go. But again, numbering everything is really important, because then the director can say, you know what, I was thinking about something different for shot 7, and maybe we can get rid of shot 8 and go directly to shot 10. If they're not numbered, it's a little tricky. So it's an important thing to learn. But again, why I'm showing you this is because these are teeny tiny little drawings that are very, very helpful in communicating. There are great directors out there, live action. Ridley Scott is one that went to art school. He's a good example of somebody who does his own storyboards and his own little thumbnails. And you can find them if you dig up, look on the internet. They're great. And I guarantee you, they're teeny tiny little drawings. So he's probably just working it out. And he would probably sit with his cameraman with nothing more than this often. Wally, I want to show you guys some thumbnails I did. These are little templates that I made for myself. So I use these all the time. And why I like these is because I can, as you can see, there's all these little notes that I've written around the images that I'm showing. These are actually thumbnails that I showed the director. This is the very first showing of Wally, and it's pretty similar to what happens, but you can see I drew up in the left-hand corner, I drew a little camera just to show the director. I was thinking the camera could move forward and then turn, and then all the red are just all the notes that I did for myself. Whether we have him moving, the director might want something different, you can see. But why I like this template is because I can do lots of little scribbles and write notes to myself. So you see his hands coming down, going into the trash. And then you can see the director wanted, I want a different angle. I want to be behind his hands going into the trash. So again, I can draw that up really quickly. And then I have little arrows telling myself where to cut. You can cross things out. Again, I like this template because there's room for me to take little notes and draw other things. And so very helpful, again, in being organized. And I did all my notes in red just so they weren't the same as the drawings. But as you can see, these are not like beautiful, pretty drawings, but all I'm trying to do is figure out what the shot structure is, whether it's a wide shot to a close-up to an over the shoulder. all that stuff. So this is what I would do. I often do these for a first pass on a sequence. As you can see in the bottom corner, I thought it might be kind of cool if Wally had spikes that came out of his hands and went into the trash. But the director was like, no, I think he should just turn them in. And, as you can see, I did little notes for myself. So the whole point of this is to just show you, you don't have to do highly labored, intensive, like really beautiful drawings, not on a first pass, especially on a feature, because things are going to constantly change. And then when you draw like this, you get better at doing very simple things that read well. And so that's really, really important. Okay, beat boards is another thing. We used to do a lot of these. We would do beat boards for an entire film and then pitch it that way. They don't do a lot of that anymore, but a lot of people still do. I love doing them because then you can do things like this. Does anybody know what film this is? Is there any responses?
Up.
Yes, exactly. So my drawing has done the job it's supposed to do, right? So this is, when did Up come out? Do you guys know the year of that? I think it was 2009, right? I think that's when the movie came out. So this drawing was done in 2004, just to show you how long it takes to make our movies. But this was in the development phase. So my job was like, I need a drawing of a house floating away. And we actually thought, well, it would be kind of cool if I actually had like an anchor, like a ship. But my job was to make an interesting drawing. So I have stuff in the foreground, I have stuff in the background. I make it, this is actually, I think all these drawings are done on pen on paper, and then I scan them in and then I color them in using Photoshop. So again, it's just one way of yes.
We have a question. Was it difficult to draw the simple rough thumbnails versus the elaborate beautiful boards?
No, the final product is always the part that I like the least. I don't like having to clean up stuff because it takes so long to do. I love thumbnails because I can do a pass on a sequence in a day or two. And then it's like, great, if I could pass them on to somebody else, awesome. But it's nice to have final images to do. But my favorite part is the thinking, is getting the script pages and trying to figure out how do I visualize what's on paper and create images that are going to be interesting. It's great to carry it all through, but it's time consuming. And I'm also coming from a perspective of somebody that's done it for 22 years. So the first 5 or 10 years, I was like, this is the best thing ever. But then you kind of like, all right, you start to learn what you like and what you don't like. I like it all, but I prefer the thumbnailing, and that stage is a lot more interesting. Okay, so I'm gonna show you some more beat boards. So this is for Up. Again, how do we show an image of the guy losing his wife's hat? I think the hat goes flying out of the house. And again, I literally have like an anchor with giant chains. It's very cartoony, but it was a lot of fun to draw images like this just to help him pitch the project. And then he basically leaves the house to get the hat and loses the house. And so we were thinking, oh, wouldn't it be kind of cool if the giant anchor drags on the ground and creates this giant, like basically trail. So again, I'm trying to play with space in these 2D images, foreground, midground. So again, you can use Photoshop to do that stuff beautifully. Again, these are all pen and ink drawings that I scanned in, colored. And as you see, the bird was an early idea, that, and the dog you see has a hat, not a collar. So the idea is nothing is set in stone, but it's your job to like come up with your own versions of what these things are. And I think in this version, there was one last egg that the bird was trying to protect. And then the guy basically helps the bird. The idea for this was that it's the last bird. So I was thinking, okay, how can I show it's the last bird and there's none left? Well, how about a bunch of empty nests? Let's use perspective and show it's very sad. And again, it's all about silhouette value, showing this bird very sad. These would have all been used when they pitched the idea before they even started production. Here's a beat board for Brave. As you can tell, this is done digitally. Why I like this is because you can take foreground elements like the other spikes and then you can blur them out, and it really does give this great sense of depth. So this was an idea, I think, when Mom fell into a bear pit, which did not end up in the final film. But again, beat boards are great because you're not wasting your time storyboarding an entire thing. You're just showing one image. This is for Cars 2. We used to have a car that was crushed to death at the beginning of the movie. It proved to be a little bit too intense, but it was really fun to do. But again, this beat board is how do we use perspective? How can we show other cars around? So this was the idea for this one bit that didn't make it in. This is another idea for Cars 2 that didn't make it in. We were going to do Running of the Bulldozers in Spain. And the idea behind this was that the bulldozers you see in this drawing were based on the bulldozers and Mater's Tall Tales. I don't know if you remember one where there's like a bull ring with the bulldozers going around. We were like, how can we use some existing assets that we already had. So this was fun. I wish I had made it into the movie, but again, that's why beat boards are great. You can just do a bunch, especially if you have a team of people that can draw up a bunch of stuff. You put it up in a room, and then the director and the powers that be look at it and go, "Oh, I like that. Let's try to work that into the movie somehow." So beat boards they're really fun. I kind of miss doing them. Plus, you can do nice images and color. And
Nate, you have a question.
yes.
It says, "What's the difference between beat board and storyboard?"
Well, a beat board is literally just what it is. It's a beat. It's an idea. What's a moment? So basically, like this, we just needed an idea for what this would be. What could a cool image show at the running of the builders? So my job was like, okay, let's have these bulldozers and the cars are getting hit, and they have people wear the red scarves. So it's just literally a beat, an idea. And so the whole point of these is to have a bunch of these beats, and you would maybe do like 60, maybe 100 for the entire movie, and you'd put them up in an entire room. And then you could talk to the director, or the director could be talking to other directors saying, well, this is what we're thinking about doing for the movie. And so again, you're not having a bunch of people storyboarding all these scenes for like 6 months, and you're not really sure if it's going to work when you can use these kind of images and just pitch them. So I hope that answers your question. They're just literally beats. They're just ideas about what a sequence could be. And they kind of go hand in hand with the script writing. The script is being written, story people are coming up with their own ideas. So that's how we would use these. I hope that answers your question. Okay, so Blue Umbrella, I wanted to show this because when I worked on this short, and I was the head of story on, it was really fun. I worked with the director, Sascha Unseld is his name. And so he had an outline. There was no real script. And so my job was to how can I help him visualize this idea? So I basically went back to my desk and I created about 70 very rough beat boards for just here are the moments in your short that I think we can work into your idea. And so these are basically what I showed the director when I got together with him. Oh, I feel like I am stuck for some reason. Okay.
Maybe unshare your screen.
There we go. We got it. Okay, so the idea being with this, the Blue Umbrella, and I'm hoping most of you have seen it, is that you don't see anybody's faces. So that was my goal, was how can I show a city alive and then the rain comes? And so I thought, okay, we can have a lot of low angles with just feet, people crossing around. As you can see, these are not highly rendered drawings. These are all drawings about yay big. And then I just did a bunch. I did about 60 or 70 of them. So then you see the rain hitting the taxi car. I really like this idea of pointing down. So when everyone opens their umbrellas, it creates interesting just images and shapes. I don't think this ended up in the short, but then there's an awning. I think this is in there. You see the water coming. This guy ended up in there. So you see the water flowing out of and you start to see faces of the city. And then you see the umbrellas, they meet each other. Again, why am I showing these? Because these are super rough. They're not highly detailed. It's just what we could do. And some of it ended up being in the short. And so this is sort of a classic over the shoulder. You're looking over her shoulder, looking at him. You're looking over his shoulder, looking at her. They sort of meet each other. You're not seeing anybody's faces. But as they come towards the camera, again, I'm using arrows, so I don't have to animate. Oh, they're going to part. And then I also love this sort of down, so you can see she's going in one direction, he's going another. And then he's quite sad. He sees her through the window. And then he's pulling his owner. So it's, okay, how do I show that? I'll have his feet moving. And then he pops around the corner. This is his POV, where you can see the umbrella going. So again, these are not really heavily detailed drawings, but they're clear enough. I just throw a little color in there. And then the umbrella is pulling and pulling. And again, some of these shots ended up in the short, so it's great. Then pulls up, and sort of it's his POV looking at the umbrella. There's a lot of stuff that happens after this. I didn't really put it in there. And then in the end, as you know, the umbrella ends up smashed on the ground. We love the idea of having a manhole cover being sad. And then they end up meeting. So again, what are the angles that I can use to not show faces? And then the last image, as you can tell, this is a digital image. I think we were very close on their faces, and then you ended up pulling out to this final image. So this is how I pitched it to the director. I used all of these images, and then we basically started making story reels and actually storyboarding all these other ideas. But as you can tell, some of those earlier images made it into the final product. So you just never know. And now that gets to film language. So much of the stuff I'm saying, I didn't know. I thought I knew. And then I started working in there and looking at scripts. I didn't understand what some of these terminology meant. So these are things that you should know getting into live action or animated storyboarding. So there's the wide shot. Most of you probably know this stuff, but you never know. So nice and wide, you can see the backgrounds, you can see the people, whatever this is, it's got to be wide. There's the medium shot. So literally between a close-up and a wide shot, this would be considered basically a medium shot, cut at the waist or at the knees. Or a close-up, I need a hand hitting a TV remote, that's a close-up. There's also often extreme close-ups of somebody's eye. There's a down shot, so again, using perspective. There's the up shot. So these are things you're going to see in the script. There's the low angle, which I really like this one. And then there's the over the shoulder. So this is what you would have with a conversation. And sometimes you're going to get script pages that are full of conversations. It's like, how do I make this look interesting? So this is often what you're going to do. Was two people are speaking to each other. This guy's always on the left, that guy's always on the right, and you would go back and forth like this. But then your goal as a storyboard artist is to think of, how can I make it more interesting? How can I come up with different angles for this? But these are just like classic terminology that you start to sort of learn as you're going along.
You have a quick question before
Yes.
What are some of the differences of animation and live action storyboarding?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's good you should ask, because I'm actually working on a live action film. I can tell you it's almost exactly the same. So the film language, all those terminology that I just showed you, the over the shoulders, the up angle, the low angle, they're all in the scripts. Now, with animation, you're making heavily, as you saw with that Nemo animatic, they're almost animated. Every scene is like that. For live action, they're not always going to make animatics. The one I'm working on now, I am working on with the director that likes to make animatics. So I'm making boards that are basically similar to an animated film. There's poses, there's movement, and he's going to basically put sound and sound effects and music to them. I worked on a project last year on a live action film where it was very different, where basically I had like a page and like 4 images to a page, and they were just going to get copied and put in a binder, and the director was just going to have them on set and go over the camera person. These are the setups. These are the 5 shots that I need for this. And so these are just different ways to do it. I love live action. It's what I'm hoping to do more of. So the project that I'm on now, it's great. I like the subject material, and I like doing something a little different just because I've done animation for 20 years. Those are my personal experiences. If you look around, they're not hard to find. Some people use animatics. Some people, like David Fincher, does a lot of storyboarding. And if you find Fight Club, he basically storyboarded that entire movie, which is amazing. Someone, again, like Ridley Scott, he will do a lot of thumbnails and have other people storyboard stuff, not for every single sequence, but it's often just for sequences that have a lot of special effects, because you have to make it very clear what is happening in that scene, because it's all about money and time and who's spending it. Does that answer your question? I hope it does. So another thing is stacking the image. And so why I want to talk about this is because even though you're doing drawings, you want to make them 3-dimensional. So this is a great shot from Shawshank Redemption that I love. It's actually the end of a boom shot that goes down. But why I like this is because you have a stacked image with lots of stuff in it. So you have the foreground, these 2 guys in the foreground. You have this guy right behind him, sort of in the midground. And then you have characters in the background. And so these are the 3 planes with that when you're storyboarding, that's what I'm thinking of all the time, whether it's something that's either wide like this or even close up. But how do I create space to make it interesting? But these are the 3 levels that we're thinking of. And again, with Photoshop, you can do that. You can fuzz out the foreground and make it look like it's actual space. So this is just one example of like how you can stack the imagery, and I like that. Using perspective is a really important thing. This is a scene from Cool Hand Luke, which is a great movie if you haven't seen it. But here we have a character whose mother has died, and he's in prison, and he's quite sad. He couldn't go see her before she died. So what does the director do? He uses perspective with these bunk beds to have the camera, basically your eye is going to go over to him, but he's also created space in between your main character and the rest of those guys. And so your wide angle shot is sort of broken into 3 spaces. So again, when you're doing boards, you're going to have to come up with images like this that will be interesting and hopefully help with the storytelling. Again, character that's lonely, everyone's giving him respect and they're giving him space. So they literally give him space in the actual image. It's a great example of what you can do. This is a wonderful movie, but I love this moment. This is the car chase scene from Rover, which is an Australian film. But again, using perspective, this is quite a lovely dynamic shot. And again, you've given yourself a horizon line, and then using all this wonderful perspective to have everything focusing on the one car that he is chasing. So even though this is live action, at some times you're going to have to be drawing images like this. I actually just did an image very similar to this recently on this movie, just to try to make it look interesting. And so here, the camera would be basically locked onto the car as it's driving down. But wonderful dynamic shot using perspective. Here's another scene from a movie called Narc, where you have a policeman who's being investigated for something that he did. So what does the director do? He puts him at the top of the screen, but he's the smallest thing on the image. And so again, using all of that perspective with the big long table and the room to have everything focused on this one character, but also all of these three characters are taking up almost like 80% of the frame, and he's the smallest thing in the frame. So all this is doing, again, with this image, is visually enhancing the storytelling. And this is why I love storyboarding, because you can come up with these ideas early in the project, and if it works, it will make its way through. Point of view is another really important thing. This is often something that would happen. I would pitch a sequence, and then the director would be like, well, it's cool and it works, but I'm not really sure whose point of view that this scene is being told from. Who's your main character? And it doesn't seem like this scene is being told from that main character. So that's really important. This is a wonderful movie called Paper Moon. If you haven't seen this is marvelous. Directed by Peter Bogdanovich. And you have a character, this con man here, who's taking this young girl who's an orphan, and he's taking her somewhere, but he's doing this business. And you sort of learn in this sequence what he's doing. And so he's yelling at her like, I need you to sit down in this seat while I'm doing business. And then I love this pose, and this is just great posing. She's like posing down. And then this is a direct POV looking right at him as he's kind of angry at her. So all this does right here is just puts the audience into the shoes of your main character, which is her, this little girl, Addie. And I love this. And then she sort of sits up as he walks to the door. And so this is literally a camera move. You just basically bump up as she's looking. And it just immediately puts the audience into the shoes of your main character. Anytime you can do that, it's very helpful. This particular scene is marvelous because it used to be two different scenes. And the director realized, oh, all this information that I'm writing out, I should really have the main character be finding it out with the audience at the same time. So he mashed it together, and that's what happens in the scene. This little girl finds out what he's doing. He's selling these Bibles as a con man. So wonderful stuff that you can learn. It's another thing that I recommend is watch these movies with director commentary. It's amazing. It's like a film school in a box. So yes, you can find this. Yes, director commentary. It's great. Another way to talk about point of view is who are your characters in the movie and what is the world they inhabit? So point of view doesn't have to be literally point of view, but I love Lady and the Tramp because the camera in this movie, even though it's an animated movie, they have to think about camera. It's always low. And so I love this. She's at this baby, I think it's a baby shower, and these women are walking around, their skirts are sort of flowing and the dog's sort of getting bustled about. But again, you can't see their faces because this is the point of view from the dog. And then she skirts across the hallway. But again, look at this image. This is a painted, somebody had to draw this and paint it, but look, somebody had to paint the underside of the table. And so this is, again, the camera is down into the world of the main character. So this really helps the storytelling. And then she walks over, and then she's in with all the men that are like smoking cigars. But this is wonderful. You don't see any faces. This is a great example of a film that, just like The Blue Umbrella, where you don't really see a lot of the people's faces in much of the movie because you're in this lower world. So that often what point of view can mean. Are there any questions at all? I can't see the chat, but any questions? No? Yes?
No questions in the chat, but I will make sure to tell you when there is.
Okay, great. So again, I just keep on reiterating, visually enhancing the storytelling. This is what storyboards can do. I love this. Less is more is probably something you've heard. Don't make it overly complicated. Even if you have a complicated script, how can I visually make it interesting without using dialogue? And show, don't tell. Again, how can I show this? How can I make this interesting? So I love when movies do this well. So this is a movie from a movie, image from a movie called Caged, which is a great 1950 black and white film. So you have a character in the foreground, a character in the background, and the woman in the background is the warden of the prison. So she is the one in control, but the floor matron, who is this woman in the foreground, she is the one that actually has control. So how does the director show that? She's the biggest thing in the frame, overlooking her. And the interesting thing about the sequence, if you see the movie, is that they get up and they walk around, and so the power play kind of shifts a little bit in the scene. But I love this image because it's very clear visually who is wielding the power just by the image. It's very quick, but all it does is help with the storytelling. Now, yes.
You do have a question around
Yes.
books or resources that you recommend to learn more about this.
Yeah, there's a whole number of them. I'd have to send a list. If people want to send, people have emails, we can basically send a follow-up list, right? Is that doable? Or
yeah, we'll just send something out to everyone who registered.
Yeah, because what I'd like to do is also I can send a list of every movie that I'm referencing, so if people want to like watch them, I recommend it. But yeah, there are there's quite a few books that you can get. One of the ones that I can recommend, which I have, is I think it's a Bruce Block book. I can't find it, but Bruce Block is his name. He has a wonderful book that has a lot of this visual language that I'm talking about. It's a little thick, but there's all these other books that you can get. Okay, so most people know what this movie is. Yes.
How can you get better at drawing perspective?
Just like anything, just by drawing. It's really, really important. The more drawing you do, the better you're going to get at it. There are things, a lot of what I love to do is all these images that I'm showing you, I just got off the laptop and I watched the movie. You can draw over them and just get a sense of what it is. It just took me a long time. I've been drawing ever since I was a kid, but one of the things that really helped me a lot was life drawing. So going to a drawing session with a model that's there, you can try to get different angles. That, I know for me personally, that helped my spatial stuff, especially with drawing people, but it really helped with perspective because the models are moving around and they're holding it from anywhere from like 10 to 20 minutes. Some are quicker, some are longer. That helped me a lot, but a lot of it is just practice. And it's also like what you're using. Like I used to draw everything in pencil and then I started drawing in pens, and that helped me kind of loosen up quite a bit. Sometimes drawing big, sometimes drawing small. It just takes practice, like anything. I don't know if that's the right answer, but it took me a lot of time and lots of drawing. That's one of the things about storyboarding I like, is that you have to do lots of drawings, throw them away, more drawings, and so I got much better over those years that I was there. Okay, why I wanted to show this image, because it's very similar, and this movie is Back to the Future. I'm sure most of you have seen this, but that same visual language is there. Somebody's big in the frame. This is when Biff stands up after, I think, Michael J. Fox tripped him. But I love this because this is, there's like 30, 40 years that separate these two movies, but the visual language is the same because it works, right? The big guy is the one that's wielding the power in this particular shot. Most people know what this movie is. This is Star Wars. This is one of the opening shots of the movie. I love this image because the image is anchored by the planet on the bottom, and you have these two other planets. This is a lovely image just in and of itself, and then you see a little ship come in, and I just remember myself being 7 years old watching this, like, what? Oh my gosh, this ship is huge. And then it comes in and it's taking up almost the entire frame, and it looks massive, but what helps it is that you have this planet over here on the left. So the spaceship looks bigger than the planet, and it's not really, but again, all of this is doing is visually enhancing this ship that comes in, and it's quite a powerful scene. It's lovely, but it's definitely enhanced by having this planet on the bottom of the frame, a little planet over there. So again, these are little things it can seem like, but somebody spent some time thinking about how this image is going to work. This is a marvelous movie called The Lost Weekend. If you haven't seen this, is early Billy Wilder. This is about an alcoholic writer who goes on a bender one weekend. And so I love this visual storytelling because he goes to the bar because he's got like $5 to get a few drinks, and he's drinking and he's pontificating, and you leave the scene with this. So right away, you're telling the audience, okay, he's had about 6 drinks, right? He's had a few drinks. And then you go back to another scene, and when you come back to this is what they do. They cut to this. And so what I love about that is that immediately you're telling the audience, oh my gosh, this guy has had way more drinks. And maybe they could have cut to him slurring and falling over and doing something else, but by literally going from this to this, I just think this is an excellent example of visual storytelling that gets the idea across very quickly to the audience. So these are things that get me excited when I see it. I'm, oh my gosh, that's amazing. What a great idea. I love this stuff. That's what gets me excited. Things like this, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. This is cool framing. I don't know if you remember the scene, but you have all these people you can't see that are out of frame. And then you have this group of people standing on the ledge and they're yelling, where did the sound come from? Because they're singing. And what does Steven Spielberg do? He does this. Up there. All these hands point. That is just marvelous visual storytelling. You didn't need to cut to something else. And it's a visual instead of people saying, pointing or yelling up or cutting back to their faces. No, you just have them stick their hands up. And it's a wonderful, wonderful visual storytelling. So Spielberg, I cannot recommend enough. Yes, some of his films are hit and misses, but man, that guy is a master of visual storytelling. And I remember I saw this when I was 7, and even at that, I remember thinking, wow, what a cool image. It's great. And again, it's an answer to a question. So this is A, this is B. So this is kind of what we're thinking often when we're storyboarding. What are A, B, and C? What are the 3 images that we can do to sell this idea? And again, this is visual. I love this. Also reveals, and Back to the Future, how do we show that Marty McFly has found his father? Because that's what happens when he travels back in time. At some point, he's going to run into his father. So what do? They have this guy walk away and reveal this. And that wonderful body language, and the audience gets right away, oh my God, that's his dad, because the mannerisms are the same. So again, trying to show examples of visual storytelling that works really, really well. Okay, so we're gonna wrap it up with shots from Elizabeth. So why I wanna show this is because the camera work in this movie is magnificent, and the camera also is almost like a character on and of itself. It's sort of conspiratorial. It's peeking around corners. It's peeking through windows. It's often looking down from sort of a god's perspective, because the whole story deals with religion. But this particular scene has Cate Blanchett walking into the government to try to get them to take the 2 churches and form them into one, which nobody wants to do. So what do? They have the guys constantly looking down on her like she's a child. So these are very specific choices that are made. And then again, using perspective, this is the chair that she's going to sit on. And so even though she's front and center and taking up the whole frame, she's still being looked down upon consistently through this whole sequence. And then they use these guys to box her in. So she's yelling and they're yelling at her. She's trying to get them to listen. So all of the frames where she's in it, she's consistently boxed in. She does get a little bigger because she starts to get them to listen, but still, as you can tell, using foreground images to like box her in. And then the men are yelling at her. And then she starts to use her wit and her charm to sort of win the crowd over. And these guys don't like it. And then she finally does win the crowd over. So what does the director do? He places her front and center. This is the first time you see her like this in the sequence. And then you pull back and she literally is higher than everybody else. So all this is doing is visually enhancing the storytelling, because there's a lot of dialogue in the scene. If I got this scene, I'd be like, oh my gosh, look at all this dialogue. How do I make it visually interesting? Well, this director does a marvelous job with that. And then he waits to the very end of the sequence. This is the only time this perspective is used, because she has won enough of these men over to get the vote that she wanted. So why I show this is because it's a great example of using camera and using images to enhance the storytelling. I also wanted to show this because it's streaming on Netflix. So please, please watch this movie. It is marvelous. It's one of my favorite movies. But again, watch what they do with the camera. The camera is a very active participant in terms of being very conspiratorial, looking around corners, through windows, and it is awesome. Okay, so we're gonna wrap it up. Visually enhance the storytelling, less is more, show don't tell. These are all things that I heard a lot of when I was working, and I tried to think of myself. These are things that I'm constantly thinking of when I'm storyboarding. Acting, the writing, the editing, the composition and the staging. These are the composition and staging are things I think of the most, because that's what you're doing when you're drawing. It's like, how can I stage the scene right, and how can I make an interesting composition? Okay, I hope that was worth watching, folks.
The question, yeah. So what Pixar film is the closest to the original storyboard, or the least deviations along the way? Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. They all changed. I'd say 2 of my favorites that probably changed the least. Finding Nemo was one where we had a very solid script, and we actually storyboarded the entire movie, which we really didn't do a lot of back then. We were constantly poking at it. Let's just do Act 1 or Act 2, or we don't even know what Act 3 is. And so even though the movie changed quite a bit. The skeletal structure of that movie stayed the same. WALL-E was interesting because we storyboarded the first act with a very small crew, 3 of us, and we storyboarded. That's basically the beginning of the movie up until WALL-E grabs onto the ship and it takes off. That part of the movie stayed pretty similar, even though it changed a little bit. And then the rest of the movie changed. But pretty much every movie I've worked on never is what it is at the end. At least at Pixar, it's constantly changing. There's like a 3 to 4 year time span of storyboarding and reboarding and reboarding. And it rarely is what it is at the beginning. But Nemo is pretty close, I think.
What are the questions you ask yourself when trying to create and tackle interesting shots?
Again, what I just showed you, basically, I'm just trying to think of like, what is the right acting? What is the right composition and staging just to sell the idea? And often it's just, I will just draw and draw and draw, and I'll try to just like think of interesting things, or I'll watch a movie for reference. Sometimes I get thumbnails, like the movie I'm working on now, I actually get very crude thumbnails from the director, and they're just enough to help me kind of get going. I do like to thumbnail. For me, thumbnailing is what gets me to the idea that I want. I might start with an idea and I'll thumbnail and thumbnail, and then I might get to a place and realize, oh, you know what? This is how I should start the sequence. But I haven't wasted a week. I've wasted maybe a day by just thumbnailing. So I will go back and start with that one image that I like. That's often why I like to work on paper. I can just scratch things out. But for me, thumbnailing helps me get to what I'm looking for. That's my personal process.
These are great questions, you guys. What is the best idea you had that never made the final cut?
Oh, boy, that's a really good question. Well, I mean, I was never such a good idea guy, but there's a lot of sequences I worked on that I like. There's one particular sequence in Coco that I storyboarded that I loved, where in this earlier version, it basically was almost like Apocalypse Now, where he was with a boat captain and they were going down this river and it was getting weirder and stranger. And they found these people that we called the clay people, and they were dead, but couldn't accept the fact that they were dead. So they basically cover themselves with clay, like skin, to look like people. And it was really weird and bizarre. And I was all over that. I was like, yes, I will board that sequence, knowing full well that I was never going to make it in the movie. But they could smell the living, so they freaked out and jumped in the river. Their skin was falling off, and I loved it. I loved every bit of that. Again, I knew full well that I was never going to make it in the movie, but that was probably one of my favorite things that I did that never quite made it into the final product.
And Rosie said, what is the right way to use arrows in storyboards?
Oh, well, again, for boards that are actually going to be in an animatic, they're not going to want arrows, but the arrows are basically just to show a director what direction your character's going, or what direction the camera's going. I would use those in a first pass, which is what I do, which is why those images I showed you for the blue umbrella, there's lots of arrows, just because I'm basically showing the director, well, this is what I'm thinking about. They're going that way, they're going that way. It allows me to not have to do a bunch of poses, because that's not what I want to do. All I'm trying to do is sell the shot and the idea. So that's where arrows would be used.
Does that make sense, Rosie?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, okay, great, no problem. Do you usually get the script or a rough draft before or after you storyboard?
Oh, that's a good question. So in the early days of Pixar, it was a little more amoeba-like. So we would get together and then they would say, your movie is greenlit. And we'd be like, that's amazing. Yes. Okay. But we wouldn't have a script. So we'd be like, okay, well, we can start anyways. You work on this idea. You work on this idea. Then we're going to get together in 2 days and talk about the whole movie as a group. And we're going to keep moving. And that's one way to do it. I think it's maddening for any manager and anybody that's trying to like keep track of stuff, because everyone's like throwing stuff around, and then the director's like, yeah, you know what? I don't like that. Let's try to do something else. And it's like that for months, if not like a year or two. That's one way of doing it. And then as the years went by, it started to become way more script based. So they would spend more time with the script, and then you would actually get a full script. And you would have a team of 6 to 10 people, and you board the whole movie, and it would still go through its paces. You'd reboard and reboard for like 2 years. So now it's, kind of script based. Like the movie I'm working on now, I got a nice script. It looks great. We broke it down into sequences, and we figured out who was going to board what. And then the question is, how much time do you have to do revisions? Because not everyone does what Pixar does, which is to like spend 3 years massaging and working and trying different ideas. That costs a lot of time and money. So yeah, I mean, every job's going to be a little different, but towards the end of my career there, it was all script based. Beginning, not so much. Bug's Life, like we didn't have an end to that movie for like 2.5 years. It was like, we'll figure it out. And then finally we were like, oh my God, we have to figure it out because the movie's going into production. So that's not the best way to do it. But it was fun, kind of exciting and more creative for the story people.
We just have a couple more minutes. So there's a few last questions. Does lighting and color play a role in storyboarding?
Do lighting and color?
Yeah.
Yes, you know, they can, depending on what project you're on and what that director likes. Color can be very helpful on Cars. We would color the main characters like Mater and McQueen and some of the other guys just to differentiate, because sometimes the boards were really rough and that's all you needed. Lighting can be very helpful, as you saw with the Nemo sequence I showed. That whole sequence was about the lighting, that's why I was so excited to do it. That was before Photoshop, so I did all of those boards in the reverse. So I had to think in the reverse, and then I had to go to the Xerox machine and like get the negative image, which is totally insane. But it was one way to do it back then, and that's what kind of excited me about it. So in sequences like that, yeah, the lighting is important, but that's often the last thing you're putting in, unless the director's like, we got to sell the hell out of this sequence. We've got to do some nice lighting. That just takes time. Color you can. I usually say no, because then everyone expects you to color everything, and then you're hating life because you're spending more time coloring than actually thinking and storyboarding.
And then do you need to know software like Storyboard Pro to get in the industry, and what should go into a portfolio?
That's a really good question. I do not know that. I know how to work on paper, and I know how to work in Photoshop, because that's all I really did at Pixar. Now that I'm on my own, inevitably I probably will have to learn some things, but I still do everything in Photoshop, and then I send it off to the editors and they cut it. So that works. I think it probably is never a bad thing to learn different ways of different boarding. I think Storyboard Pro is, I think, the one that people use the most. And then for your what to show, I think it's important to show rough stuff. We always looked for rough and thumbnails and things like that, because it showed us what the person is thinking, because we want to be able to hand that person script pages and not have to worry. We want to make sure that they know what they're doing and they know film language, which is why I talked about that today. Knowing film language is so important, because you're going to get these directions and the director's going to want to see something in like 2 days. Often, hopefully you have more time, but you're going to have to know how to do it. And like anything in life, you're going to make mistakes and do bad versions of things, but you'll get there. But you have to know the language, and you have to know what to do when you get those pages. I remember the first time I got my pages, I was like terrified. I didn't really know how to start, which is why thumbnailing is something I really talk about.